Yeah, so Dr. Vinayak has already talked about, the premise that I'm going to talk about, my context. So I do come from, I'm an architect, and I do come from very much an architectural background where for me also heritage management was a lot about, buildings and the built fabric. And then in 2012, I started, looking at Baroda, Vadodara, where I come from, Gujarat, and I was looking at an exercise on regenerating historic areas, and that is where I started looking at, the fact that it's not only about the built fabric, but it is also about the interrelationship between the tangible and the intangible also, which actually makes this entire, the landscape. And that's from where my interest developed, and which has actually gone on to get me into a doctoral
Not
work.
audible, sir.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, madam. I think there is a problem from your side. We are able to hear you, madam. We are able to hear Miss Niyati Jiyasu. Yes, madam.
Okay,
Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah. So this picture is actually from Amritsar, one of my case study areas, and I'll talk a little detailed on it as we, move on to this another the slides. Okay, I would like to start with this picture. I don't know how many of you have been to Jaipur, but in Jaipur, if you go, you will actually see this in the Badi Chowk, which is basically a chalk on a crossroads, where you see these flower vendors who are actually sitting on this side in the morning, and it's a beautiful smell that you actually feel when you move around, and it's a beautiful area of colors. And as discussed with Dr. Shikha Jain, who is a person behind the nomination of this, and whose team Trona Foundation is behind the conservation of this whole part. In 2012, they actually decided that because these people are a part of the entire landscape, and this has been since many centuries, even if it's not the flower market, I think most of you would agree that, in most of the historic areas, you have a lot of these vendors who will be sitting around in the chalk or even on the main roads, and they'll be part of this, the economic thing. So in 2012, they actually decided that they should be given some kind of a semi-permanent kind of a structure, and this was what was designed. So it's something which can be locked up at night, and in the daytime, it doesn't become a very permanent structure. 2014, the mayor decided that they should be totally relocated. One reason was also because the shops which were behind, they decided that they felt that their shops were not getting proper exposure because of these people sitting right in the front. So they got together and they talked to the mayor. Also now, if you know, there is a metro and other works going on there. So these people were asked to relocate. Now this picture which I have put forward is from February 2020, just this year, and these people are back. So my question actually starts with the same premise that are we actually talking about a historic urban area or some kind of a historic city where you just remove these people and that's okay? Does it work? What are we looking at? What is a historic urban area? Is it only about the built fabric? What is heritage? Is it only about the pink buildings that you actually see at the back, the buildings which were actually made by the king at the time of the inception of Jaipur? So even today, if I look at heritage of Jaipur, am I going to only talk about these buildings, and am I going to talk about heritage management only about the buildings? So I start with this basic question. So my presentation is actually going to look at widening the understanding of heritage, contextualize tangible within the intangible, and integrated heritage management. So a way forward, which is never a stamp, option, but there are only guidelines or ideas that we can actually look forward towards. So, as most of us would know, I do agree with the fact that I think, sir, as I have been told, that some of you are not from architectural background. So I might go into a little detail in that direction also. That initially from 1976, we always used to have heritage as basically monuments and sites. So it was monuments, which you already know, the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort and those kind of things, or it can be a group of buildings, so some buildings which come together. Even historic areas, where I would basically, if I put it in common language, I would say old cities, city areas, like Chandni Chowk in Delhi. So they were also considered as group of buildings. And in 2003, though in 1980s, they started actually talking about the fact that intangible are also part of the tangible, and it's not only the built fabric that we have to look, is part of the heritage. Even these, the intangible component is part of the heritage. It was in 2003 that actual convention was developed by UNESCO, which exactly said what I have put forward includes traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and universe, or the skills and knowledge to produce traditional crafts. So these also became part of the heritage, and so now we are looking at the tangible plus the intangible within the frame. So this is a constellation put forward by UNESCO, which talks about the ICH. ICH is Intangible Cultural Heritage, where they actually put down the costumes. It can be festivals, family, dance, vocal music, culinary expertise, etc. And all of this actually come together. The basic characteristics of an intangible is that it's human born, hence mobile and ephemeral. So if I look at performing arts, if I look at any other this thing, then you can actually say that because it's propagated, or it is created by the people who are doing it, it becomes mobile. So even if I look at these these people are tandoor makers in Amritsar, so they are on the outskirts of the historic areas, and they have been here for long. In fact, they say that they came from north hub of India before, and then they came here and they settled. Then you also have a lot of these craftsmen from in Jaipur who actually came from as far as even Afghanistan and those areas, and then they came down to Delhi and they settled around. And when Savai Jai Singh was actually building his city, he invited a lot of these craftsmen to come and settle in his area. So they came down to Jaipur, and after Jaipur, the families actually dispersed to various parts in Rajasthan. So you find all these people, shifting from here to there, and their skills and the traditional craft also shifts, or any kind. Even performing arts, it also shifts with, people when they shift, even rituals, even practices. It's limited in duration because it's limited in the time that it is actually created, and then it's recreated over the time, and continuously evolving. Since it is born by the community, it is propagated by the people, so it is always mouth-to-mouth transmission of these things, and so it continuously evolves also. It changes over the time. Transmitted from generation to generation and often spread over large areas or dispersed. So as I mentioned, that it can be also spread over large areas depending on how people migrate from here to there. Rick Smith also talks about one thing where he says that there's an absence of link with the specific physical, which is one point which I have contested as far as my doctoral scholar is concerned, and I will come down to why I'm contesting that part of why I'm saying that it doesn't have a link with a very physical space as such. So from the tangible to the intangible to we finally come to the historic urban areas, which I would say the container and the contained, because above you have this Jaipur in all its it has been there has been a lot of conservation work going on, so it has been restored. Some part has been restored, some part has been also painted, and some has been preserved. And so historic towns this is a definition which comes from the UNESCO operational guidelines, where they say that they are still inhabited and which by their very nature have developed and will continue to develop under the influence of socio-economic and cultural change. Now, why I'm coming to this is the container and the contained is that within this walled area, this beautiful built fabric that you see around, you actually also have spaces which you see below, which are the places with, this intangible heritage or tradition. It can be traditional craft also, it can be performing arts and other things, rituals also, this where these things are created. So this is the same place where, all these things come together. And that is why the context is very important. So if Rudolph basically says that a built heritage is a spatial representation of culture, while intangible is a behavioral representation of culture. So we have culture in both its cases, and so that means that when you actually talk about the behavioral, when you talk about socio-cultural practices, rituals, they need some kind of a built form or locations to facilitate that behavioral representation, and that is how this container and the contained come together. So if I put it simply, it will be the building components. You have the activities, which includes the ritual practices, performing art, the traditional crafts, everything, all kinds of activities, and the meanings and symbols that they actually have with our culture and our socio-cultural system, our society, our identity. And they all come together within this culture. If you look at Jaipur, there is a part at the back which is a planned city. With, like I said, that there's a lot of work going on even right now. So you have these buildings which are at the back, and then you have this small temple which you can see just in front of the tree, which might not have been part of the plan. This thing, somebody must have built it, but now it is a part of the practice, and it is part of identity of people. And there are a lot of people who actually, move around, and they just bow their head and they move forward every day. So this becomes part of it. In the next picture, you have these. It's a house which has on the top. If you see, there's a purple colored those cords. So they are those colored cords which are made in tie and dye, and which become part of. So all these things, if you move around the city, and the picture which I showed you right in the first page where I was talking, first slide where I was talking about the Amritsar Gali, which is a Chuda ki Gali, where they sell bangles. And so when I walk around the cities, it's not only about the buildings which I see at the back, but it is all these other things also which come together within it. Also, we have in India, we have a lot to do with otherwise also, but in India especially, we have a lot to do with this nature-culture relationship. So this is a picture from Amritsar, the Harmandir Sahib. I think a lot of you would have visited it. So there is the temple, then you have the water around it, and then you have this tree, which is a Duk Banjani tree, which is supposed to be, good for anybody who has any kind of, problems in life. And so people come here and they worship, and everybody takes a dip just next to this, the small water area next to this tree. On the other side, you have this tree which is in the lanes of Amritsar, where you have this temple, and within that temple you have this tree actually, coming out. So it must have grown over the time, and then the temple also developed, and so all this have become, part of this identity of this area. So even though earlier it was actually these buildings which are actually built at some point of time, and how they came about, but today, if I look at it, I see them all in one frame. I see the buildings, I see the people, I see the tree, and I see the temple together. This comes from Rahul Mehrotra's, he's a top conservation architect, who has also done this classic amazing work on, Kumbh Mela, where he actually talks about that in India, nothing is, totally permanent, in the sense that because like the flower shops that I was talking about, the Kumbh Mela is also something, it's like a city, which actually comes into being every few years, and then it stays on for some months, some days, and then it just goes off as if there was nothing out there on that site. and to come back after some years. So but we can't say that that is not a heritage. That is also part of the heritage. That is something that has been developed, that has happened over the years, that has also evolved, because every year, with the kind of socio-cultural systems, the number of people who come here, the kind of rituals that could also be changing, these things also do keep on changing, and they could keep on evolving. But it is not even a permanent structure. It is something which comes on all of a sudden on a blank slate over the time. So I come down to traditional crafts, which is what I have been working on, which looks at practices which employ manual dexterity and skill, and an understanding of traditional materials, designs, and techniques to make or repair useful things. So that's a definition which has come from Jennings, and then UNESCO also has its own definition, where it says that it can be completely produced by artisans, either completely by hand or help of hand tools or mechanical means, as long as direct manual contribution of artisan remains. The basic characteristics would be that it is traditional, contemporary, and living. It is not only about the past, but also traditions practiced today. So even these, whatever craft that we actually see, they evolve over the time, depending on how and what kind of social systems that we have. The tie and dye, also the kind of the patterns that come about, the kind of designs that they work on, they all change over the time. It is inclusive because it includes the practices that might not be specific to one culture. It contributes to social cohesion and sense of identity and responsibility within individuals or people of different communities to feel part of it. Especially if you look at, there are these bangle makers of Jaipur who make bangles in lakh. That is, shellac that you say that you can actually get from these trees. So it is actually grown by insects on a tree, and that is brought down, and it is made into this lakh. So it is actually, this is a craft which is actually made by the Muslims. They were the people who came from Afghanistan side. They came down and they settled outside Delhi, and from there they came down to Amer, and from Amer they were invited to Jaipur, and that is how they have actually settled here. And so they are Muslims, but they make this lakh bangles for Hindus, because Hindus are the ones who actually use it in their traditions. So and these traditions can vary for different people. For the Rajasthanis, it is totally about, the wedding bangles, the bangles which is actually worn at certain occasions, certain festivals. For other people, for the tourist, it can be just something which is, that which you can take home as a souvenir, as something which is part of the fashion accessories. So it can mean two different things. Representative of the community, it thrives on the knowledge and the knowledge of traditions, skills, and customs, and it's community-based, since its recognition is based on the community. Because as UNESCO says that only that intangible is recognized, which is recognized by the community itself. I would come down to why I actually took up traditional craft, because when I said initially that intangible heritage actually takes up a lot of other things, rituals, practices, and performing arts and other things, and I took up traditional craft because, like I mentioned before, that I'm an architect. So basically, I do look at my premise starts from the built fabric. So if you look at traditional craft, it's a product. It is part of the skills also. It is something which actually has a tangible part to it also. So it is when you look at traditional craft, it has an intangible part, which is the craft and the skills and the knowledge, which is carried forward, which is a symbol of identity, which is a symbol of living culture, which is part of the livelihood. And then you also have the product, which is also a symbol of identity and a socio-cultural system, but which is actually a tangible part to it. And if I'm coming back to this photograph, because if you look at traditional craft, then they have a footprint as far as the historic urban areas or historic areas are concerned. So if I look at this picture, then the street facade is more defined by these craft products than the built fabric behind it. So also the traditional planning. If you look at Jaipur, if you look at Amritsar, you look at many other cities, then a lot of this traditional planning was actually done according to craft. So you do have in Amritsar, I do have Chuda Wali Gali, and you have the Kesar Vadiya, where these food craft is actually done. Then you have in Jaipur, you have the Maniharo ki Gali, you have the Khazane Wala Rasta, which are all part of which is part of the stone carvers. So a lot of these traditional planning was actually done according to the different crafts which came here. And even though Amritsar was developed more organically, Jaipur was more. It's a perfectly well developed. I think it was at that point of time, it was the first city which was developed on a perfectly blank slate and with all the on the grid pattern. So, but in both the cases, the traditional planning does have a lot to do with the craft which actually comes with them. The streetscapes, the physical form, the aesthetics, the traditional built fabric, even the built fabric is based on what the craft has within, because earlier it was always, even when you talk about this chuda, they were actually made here and they were also sold here. But now, today you don't have it that way. Today they have all become shops, but earlier this buying selling was at one place. So if you look at the historic areas, it is traditional craft is part of it, in the sense of where you can buy materials, where you create it, and where you sell it. So all these things come together within that entire landscape. Socio-cultural, because it's a social cohesion, cultural role in the society, part of the identity. Economic would be yeah, so, and it has a very strong economic footprint, because most of these old cities have a strong footprint as far as the economic part is concerned in these historic areas. Like I mentioned before, that so it becomes a part of it's a raw material, the place of procurement, it's a part of working, where a place of practice, it's a part of sale, the place was sale. And it's it's also a symbol of identity, part of the social systems and the living culture. And all these things come together in the historic urban environment, where they come together as spatial organization, as a settlement pattern, as a relationship to the built and to the open. If you talk about the Chudewali Gali, earlier they used to, have a lot of these some kind of a cots which were made, wooden cots, where they used to sit outside on within these lanes and make it, because it needs heat also, and then they used to sell it in the shop behind. So all these things were part of this system. So, and why are we actually talking about this? Because this is the on the left side, you can actually see these are called the tateras. So they make something from brass or any other material, and so they do a lot of because this is from Amritsar. They are doing a lot of work in embellishments with or decorative pieces that you actually use on gurudwaras and temples. So this is a meeting where we actually were talking about, what can be done, how in the Hriday plan that was being worked about. There was a meeting where the discussion was on how traditional crafts should be, worked upon, in the sense of how should it that come together as a part of the heritage management overall framework. This next is also very much into kites, but it doesn't have a one special day as far as Gujarat has. It's more of, over the winters, then you have these huge kites which are made at the place. And these people whom you see just sitting around, they are actually part of the tea traders. Now, why this is important? This is not exactly craft, but this is also something like a trade. This was a traditional trade, because Amritsar came on the original route where from Kolkata to up Afghanistan, there used to be a trade route. And that trade route used to, take a lot of these karwas and other people, moving around. And because of that, in fact, even today along that road which was used by these people, you actually see a lot of sarai, that is rest houses, and other infrastructure also. So these people also, some of them, they actually came down, they were earlier from here, then they went to Calcutta to work there, and then they realized that tea was something which they can bring back, so their ancestors brought it back. And there's a huge area which actually a lot of shops which sell open tea in sacks, and which still today comes from these places, Darjeeling and Calcutta side. Like I said, why we are talking about this left side, if you see this picture, this is a part of this cultural, the economic system of the tea traders. So these were small, open discussion points which were made, where the middlemen used to come from Calcutta. They used to discuss with the shopkeepers here of the prices of the tea and everything, and then this tea used to come here. So there were these meeting rooms which were actually created earlier on. Today they are still, kept the kaddas, even though this is not used for, any kind of meetings and other things, and they just use it for sometimes sitting, or because as you already saw that they don't have so much work now, because now we have all these package teas and other things. But still, this was part of that entire the economic system of this place, or this lane especially. This picture on the right side you actually see is the be a person who makes that kites. So when we are talking about so much about the built fabric, and we talk about heritage management of the built fabric, now just talking about the built fabric is not going to help till I don't actually look at the traditional craft which is within, until I don't actually work towards the economic augmentation of the craft. Because that's exactly the premise where I started from, in the sense of 2012, when I was walking around this Baroda, and one of the places, we asked somebody that, you have such a beautiful old house, and why don't you restore it? And that person said that, ma'am, I can do it, but if I have 10 lakhs to do it, I can do it. So that's where this whole thing comes about. But even though economy was not part of our values as far as UNESCO is concerned, because earlier UNESCO only talked about values in terms of historical and spiritual and architectural values, significance of any kind of a place. Now we also talk about the economy, because that is definitely as part of the backbone, and people who are from the finance would definitely and that. So if I talk about defining heritage management, it's basically application of management techniques to conserve and develop cultural resources so that they remain part of the cultural heritage with long-term value and benefit for the general public. So heritage management plan is a document that is a result of process which identifies heritage values. Obviously, it needs documents which talks about the existing state of place, identifies and analyzes needs. You need to develop the objectives, the strategies to meet the objectives, and lay out a bigger plan or the framework for implementation of all this. Now, the most important thing when you actually look at any kind of especially a built heritage, has always been the heritage significance, the authenticity, and the integrity. Why do we look at it? Because heritage significance basically justifies the reason behind our, heritage management process. So if I'm looking at a building, if I'm going to restore it, if I talk about adaptive reuse of it, if I talk about, just documenting and preserving it, or if I talk about, rebuilding it, the values behind this building will actually justify why I want to do it. Authenticity, it also talks about that, how authentic that entire, building or the build fabric is. So that there has been a lot of contemplation on all that of what authenticity is, because UNESCO actually talks about that, even when you actually work on retrofitting or restoring of it, then whatever new additions that you make to the building, they should be seen very clearly as new additions, and then you have the authentic thing. Integrity is about the overhaulness of this entire framework. So I won't go into total detail about all this, but basically, if we look at heritage significance as far as UNESCO is concerned, it for any kind of a building, it always talked about aesthetic, architectural, historic, scientific, economic, symbolic, social, spiritual, use, non-use also, bequest also, whether it is handed over from generation. So this was what legitimized the heritage protection that is required. So any kind of a heritage management plan always has to start with looking at its cultural values. Even the nominations that go into the UNESCO World Heritage List, they actually start with the cultural values that each of the building has. But when we talk about intangible cultural heritage, especially because it is part of the community, it is not something, it's not a red fort, which is now with the government, and where you have the conservation professionals who will come in and say that, it is architecturally, it is very sound, and that is why it is very important, and or it has a scientific value because it actually put forward some different techniques of construction, or those kind of things. But as far as intangibles are concerned, it's always about whose values are we addressing and whose heritage is it. So while acknowledging the importance of establishing professional standards of practice for protection of world cultural heritage, it is imperative that universality of practice and adoption of standards do not overwhelm the local values. This picture I put forward about Khajuraho is basically, this is a book by Shobita Punjab. It's a beautiful book which basically talks about that. If I look at the different perspectives, the local people, for them, the value of this temple is very different, because they worship here and they have a very specific type of rituals that they might be following here. But for people who are tourists, for them, it is more about the sculptures, it is more about the architectural value of this building. So it all depends on whose values that we are looking at. And are we going to talk about imperialism, in the sense that I just put forward my set of values there, saying that, if I talk about a traditional craft, then I say that, this is, the value is only about the product of how I see it. Or I'm going to talk about something, what a Rajasthani or a person from Jaipur who is actually going to look at it from his point of view, where he's going to look at it from how they use it during their festivals. Also, heritage is not about one day theme, so it can't be that today I say that it's a wonderful hairstyle and outfit, and tomorrow I say it's not appropriate. So it's not about a one day theme, it's more about a entire generation of how we take it forward. Also, values is all about perception of values, and I'll show it with examples later. But basically, it also talks about who is actually valuing the heritage. Now, this actually comes up. Can be taken in context of built heritage also, and intangible heritage also. So whether it's a government sector who would more look at infrastructure development, interventions required for economic enhancement. You have the heritage professionals who will be mainly talking about the conservation, the aesthetic, cultural, social values of how that can be maintained. But if it is tourist, then obviously they'll be talking about the experiential enhancement of how the tourism can be better experienced over the time. And or the community, where they also would be talking about the infrastructure development, but they would be talking about infrastructure development of a total different kind compared to what maybe the tourism would be wanting. So that is why the agenda also changes, and when the agenda shifts, there could be the issue at the end of the end result of how it works. So even though there are values which have been put up by the UNESCO, at the end of it, all these things, come into the picture. So I'm just putting forward all the nitty-gritties of how, intangible is a very complex framework that we now need to work on, especially if you look at historic urban areas. If I look at ICH and authenticity, now this conversation was very interesting, and this is a conversation which has been put forward by Coverdin in his book, where he says that, like I mentioned before, that UNESCO talks about very clearly that authenticity is very, very important part of their framework if I need to nominate my building for a UNESCO World Heritage List. But here this person says that he went to Kyoto and in a gold pavilion where he has a discussion with this guide who says that I was told that it has not. He says that it's great that this building has weathered for a long time, and even though it was built in the 14th century, and he's told that no, it was not weathered and it has been burnt down twice. So is it the original building? And I had asked my Japanese guide, but yes, of course, but it was burned down. Yes, twice, many times, and rebuilt. Of course, it's an important and historic building with completely new materials, but of course, it was burned down. So how can it be a same building? So it's always the same building. So this goes totally against, what UNESCO talks about as far as World Heritage buildings are concerned, because here the building has been totally rebuilt over the time. But this is also a point that we actually need to look at, that where we are talking about that the original, the idea of the building, the intention of it, its design are all immutable. The essence of the building, the intention of the original building is what survives. The wood of which the design is constructed decays and is replaced when necessary. So it's not about the material, but it is the essence, the spiritual part of this this place. That is what is most important, and that is the intangible part within that tangible whole, and that is what needs to remain intact. The picture which I have on the side, this is actually the Fulkari. If you look at the dark one, that is actually the original Fulkari work, which is done by people in Punjab. This was actually done in the lanes of Amritsar for quite some time in all the, the households, and now it has actually shifted to the outskirts, to the villages only. In the villages also, a lot of people do it because a lot of people want to get into the white collar jobs, and nobody wants to get into these traditional craft. And the rest too are actually from they are made in Calcutta. They are Fulkari work. They are made in Calcutta, and they are also made by machine. So in this globalized world, we also have this issue which is coming up, that that earlier this traditional craft was always used to be a part of our identity. Like if you are from the tourism department, you would know that when we go to any kind of a tourist place, and this the souvenirs of that local place is what is the most important. And but today in this globalized world, I actually have these things which are sold in Amritsar, but then these two are actually made in Bengal, and that also not by hand, but they are made by machines. And at the same time, you also have one more thing, that the Punjabis, they say that when they actually have the auspicious ceremony, the first ceremony for the girl when she's going to get married, then this has to be a very handmade thing, because that is considered to be auspicious. You can't have machine made things. So then in that case, they definitely buy something like this, which might be expensive also for some people, but they still give one handmade thing to the bride to be. So ultimately, it is also that identity which actually is taken forward, and which is as important. So authenticity, that is why initially, because it was only about the buildings, UNESCO talked about design, materials, workmanship, and setting, because that's what has to be intact if I'm going to talk about that building. But later on, because when 2003 the Intangible Heritage Convention came about, then and there was a question of the fact that this is continuous and evolving, and it will change also. So these things could not, work with that. So the authenticity also had, certain other parameters where they talked about the spirit and the feeling and language. And on the Hoi-An protocols in 2009, they came up with, spirit and emotional impact and religious context, the sounds, the smells, and the taste, the creative process, the artistic expressions. So other than, all these things which were there earlier because of the built fabric or the built, monuments and buildings, these other things also have now, been come about, which are not materialistic, but they are also part of the authenticity of a heritage. In India, if you look at, this is a picture from South Asia, but still in India also, if you know that, it's not, authenticity is not about having a building also in itself. So if you have a tree and then somebody just lights a, a diya around it, and then so it actually becomes a ritual, because sometimes it's also because of the tree, the speciality of the tree, or sometimes it's only because somebody has done it before and the others actually follow that system over the time. So Yukilito, who is like, father in conservation and who has worked so much in authenticity and who has written so much in conservation as well as especially authenticity, he basically talks about that it's not the built form of the temple and the God's image within that makes the place significant, but it's acknowledgement of the God's presence, the spiritual dimension of the religious faith that gives the real meaning. So this is where we are looking at that, it's not always the tangible that we that becomes the important part. The heritage is also all about the acknowledgement of the spiritual presence, the acknowledgement of the spiritual dimension of any kind of, whether it's a religious faith, whether it's any cultural faith, or it's any kind of a social part of our social systems. And this acknowledgement actually comes from the community of the people. So it does this significance will come from the community, and it will not come from the experts in the field. So when we talk about heritage management, it is very important to take into consideration of these significance of how, community actually has a more bigger role to play in it, and not only the experts that we as we take ourselves to be. So integrity is all about, the wholesomeness of and the intactness of the natural or the cultural heritage and its attribute, where even if I look at the intangible, you have this, the kind of work that has been done. And historic integrity also relates to intangible values such as a building or a site's cultural association and tradition. So it's not only about the building in itself, but also what were its cultural association, what was its traditions, what was the system, what context it was in, how is it. So if I look at Harmandir Sahib, then it is not about only the building in itself, it is about the religious place, it is about the water around, it is about the Pradakshina path which is around, it is about the community, it is about the bazaars around, the entire context of why that building actually came into being. Mohammad Badri, he is conservation professionals who actually, puts up these diagrams many times to, put everything into one perspective. So I have just put it for that reason mainly, that if I look at cultural heritage science and how do they all come together within, and of course I need the heritage legislation within that. So you have the conservation, you have economic, you have management, where so you have in conservation, it can be restoration, it can be building material, architectural, rehabilitation, adaptive reuse, urban conservation, heritage impact assessment, technology, economic is basically financing, the fundraising, sustainable tourism, event management, outreach, and management can be community engagement, visitors management, heritage interpretation, and heritage pedagogy and education also, which is very, very important. And all these also definitely need, either they can be heritage legislation or more guidelines which can be, binding to these things. This is a management, framework which has been put up by Joseph King from ICROM. They have done a lot of work in capacity building. So they look at how these things can be done. So management systems have have actually only been discussed in the last, 12, 15 years. And a system basically talks about regulating, interacting, and interdependent group of items forming a unified whole. So where it would be basically a framework of, policies and institutional framework and resources. So for heritage, we can say that the management system is all about elements necessary to enable an improvement in the safeguarding of the heritage according to its values. So again, that values is what comes into picture. This is an entire framework that they have put forward because, and it's also something that it's not a straight process. Heritage management is also like a cycle, because then you actually start look at planning, then you look at the planning, you look do the implementation. Over the time, you have to monitor it, and again you come back to planning if there are any issues with it. And then you look at all the different resources which are available, the institutional infrastructure and the framework which is needed, and you also need the legal framework over it. And there is a overall, the outcomes and the outputs. So outputs are the ones which are, the short-term gains which are going to, be for each of these, the planning and the implementation, the strategies that you'll be working on, and outcomes will the overall overarching outcome that you will actually gain from this entire exercise. And when you start working on these plans, now it can be a management plan, which can be a physical conservation plan, it can be intangible heritage conservation plan, it can be a maintenance plan only, it can be community involvement plan, it can be interpretation plan, interpretation of heritage sites, which is now becoming very important, when you talk about tourism. Tourism visitor management plan, disaster risk management plan, which we'll be talking tomorrow, and monitoring plan. So it can be one plan or it can be all of it. And in fact, actually it has to be a comprehensive planning of all these components together within one heritage management plan. I'll just come down to a little of these different heritage approaches which have been taken so far. But before that, I'll come down to 3 examples and discuss, how they look at it. So, and why we are actually, saying that, heritage management is a complex system, and it is not only about building that I need to, conserve. If we, this project we know from long, it has been in and out of the news for so many years. In fact, the first clip which I have taken up is from the Los Angeles Times, which is in 1993, where they say that India to close factories near polluted Taj Mahal. And then there was one which says that no construction zone declared within 500 meters of Taj Mahal, Supreme Court told. And then there was the Supreme Court removed ban on industrial construction in Taj Trapezium zone, Agra, which is a very recent one. So the issue is, we all do understand the fact that, the Taj discoloration is a very, very major grave concern. And it is definitely should be taken as the utmost, the biggest, of the utmost priority by the government. And and that is one reason why, these factories were closed down. Though there are some people, experts basically, who do argue that it is not only the factories who are actually, discoloring it. There are other reasons, and there is a lot more research which needs to be done. But yeah, factories may have been one of them, so they were done. If you read this part, which is written by Sunita Narayan, Sharma and Singh in article, where they say that the fact is that poor people in Agra have paid a big price to keep the environment of the Taj clean. Industries have been closed down, relocated, and many lives disrupted, made poor. This was possible because the direction came from the Supreme Court, which was acting in public interest, but it was also possible because the people who were impacted by these decisions were poor and powerless. Now, the issue is not that, we don't need to do anything about the Taj. Definitely, the factories have to be re-looked at. But the issue is also that what about the community which is staying around it? Now, if we talk about the Taj complex in itself, it was actually built as a complex, and then there were also these lot of sarais and a lot of other buildings which are built around for the workmen who were working there. And then that was also part of that complex. And then there was the city which actually developed over the number of years. So the community was also part of it. So we can't just look at Taj Mahal in isolation of the community which were part of it, because now the community and there has been a division which has been created between. In the sense that Amita Beg, who is also a very important conservation person, a person who writes in conservation, who says that there might be one generation where Agra would be just the city of Taj Mahal, tourism, the the hotels and the hotel industry, basically the tourism industry around, and the community will be totally out, the citizens will be totally out of it. So how do we look at heritage management when you have these kind of situations? The Kashi Vishwanath temple, the case of Varanasi, now this has also been in a lot of discussion as far as conservation architects are concerned. If some of you have actually visited this spot, there's a small, temple in this entire area. There's a small temple, but obviously it's a very, very important temple for all Hindus. Even I have visited it, and when you go there, it's small lanes that you have to go through. So if I look at it from the point of view of just being a tourist or a devotee, then I would definitely feel that something should be done to it, because there is a very narrow lane that I need to go through, and it's not even clean, and you need other infrastructure, and I have to stand a lot in the line because of that, and I can't even worship very clearly because then I'm pushed inside, and then I also need to get out faster because there are other people who are standing in the line. So definitely my experience as a devotee is not good for now. It's not as calming as it should be, and things should be done to it. And this is what is new plan which has come about, which is very interesting because it goes down to all the way to the Ghats. But the issue could also be that there are a lot of these communities which are around, they have been relocated from here, and they were also part of this community. This temple was not only about the temple which was built. This temple was something which was about the buildings which were built around it. It was totally within those people around, because initially buildings were actually, the temples were made in such a way, especially if you go to Baroda, in most of these lanes, at the beginning of these lanes, you will actually have a temple. So all the traders who would actually go out for work, they would go down their head and they would go out on the main road. So temples were actually part of our community in a way. Even Chandigarh, which is a very modern, planning, which are contemporary in 1960s, which was done, that also talks about one temple in each sector. So it has always been a community thing. So this, I'm just putting forward questions of what are the issues which can actually come about, and what are the different sides to this processes. My case study area, the Amritsar. So this is also based on the paper that I had written, where I had actually questioned that this is also a place. Amritsar was actually built by Guru Ramdas. He dug a small lake here, a water body here, and he started working on this small temple. And at that time, he called 32 different types of trades and traders and artisans to come and settle here. And that is how this city, which was earlier a town, which developed. So even today, you have a lane which is called the Battis Hatia. Hatia is actually shops. So you have these 32 shops which had craft and traders who came here and who settled here. They came from Kashmir, they came from Gujarat also, and they came from many places around. And so this was also part of that entire, the context. So you had the temple, small temple, and the water around, because that is part of the Sikhism as a religion. And then you had these bazaars which were around. So when I talk about a devotee, then he would actually come here, he would, bow his head here, and then he would go around all these bazaars, whether it is a Papad Badiya Bazaar, where you would actually buy papad and badiya, which is a food craft. You have the Chura Wali Gali, where you buy something else. Then there were other places where they had books. There were places where you could buy these fulkaris. You can buy, clothes and other things, and you go back. So that was the entire journey of these people. Um, Today, this is what has become. So you have that huge plaza around, and you have this area, and at the very end where you can, see that big LCD which is put up, the screen where you put up, that is actually a huge parking for hundreds of cars, and so you can actually come till there, you park there, and then you don't have any vehicle here, and you walk down here, or you can even take a rickshaw, and you come to the temple, and you go ahead and you can actually go back. Now, as a tourist, as a devotee, it would be a great idea, because now I have got huge open space to, move around. I don't, tussle with other people, and there's a nice, it's a very beautified space that I see around. And then there's also a museum which has been put, brought up, and so I can look at all that, and I go back. The issue which came about was when I started talking to all the bazaars around. So the bazaars around, they said that because this has now been created as a touristic zone, so the agenda of this, because this was done by the tourism department, and obviously it is very important that the touristic, the experiential should be very interesting, and which has actually come about. So all these buildings where there were a lot of these bazaars which were shops which were taken away from here. Then there are these old shops which are beautified, and you have these new shops which have come up at the back. At the end, the red building that you see at the back, that is actually a facade which has been created. So some of these places you actually don't have the original buildings also, but you actually see a new facade that has been created here. And then you have these lampposts and other things which have come about, and it's a very interesting place that has been created. You have these souvenir shops where you can buy. But now the journey, or the experiential journey of the tourists, has been restricted to the parking, to the Harbandar Sahib, to back to these shops to buy the papad vadiya, and go on to their own house. So they now don't go to these, the bazaars around, which was actually part of that system also. And at the same time, the bazaars were the economy of this area actually dependent on the bazaars also. And the economy of the bazaars was dependent on these tourism. So there were 14 market associations who actually, had a court case against. It was not exactly for this, but it was for how they can change the parking and other things. But obviously they lost. So I'm at this juncture, I'm not exactly saying that this is a wrong way to do it, or this should not have been done. But yeah, we do have to look at a lot of other things which sometimes won't fall into place. So it's also about, so now there have been a lot of these within the Hriday plan, they are actually trying to make these heritage walks, where these heritage walks pass through all these lanes. Because if you look at Amritsar, within these lanes also, they're beautiful old traditional fabric which you otherwise won't see if I just move around this area. So there are heritage walks which are being created, but then now the context of this entire area has actually changed to only this. Yeah. So this is a gate which has been created just outside Amritsar, and then yeah, these are the shops which I was talking about. That there the shops below, and these have now become the hotels. Earlier they used to be homes. So especially if you look at the case of Amritsar, this was how it was in the 19th century. With totally the tight lanes of bazaars around. It was very organic meandering bazaars. Because earlier it was that, there were, after Ramdas got these people, then there were these 12 missals which were created. So there were these 12 mohallas in a way. So each had its own chieftain, and he had his own bazaars, and he had his own people and his area around. So they were all created around this. And so this was developed very organically as opposed to Jaipur. And in 1984, because of the Blue Star operation, where the terrorists came within this the Golden Temple, this entire green area that you see around, that was actually decongested by the government, because obviously nobody would want that they go back within that area, and this was not used as a refuge. That is as told. So this area, there were 3-4 bazaars here which were actually removed, and now they have been shifted to. Some have been shifted to the bus stops, and so basically they have been shifted around 7-8 kilometers away from this entire area. And then recent development has again removed people from here, which is this lighter green color which you see. So now if you look at the Harmandir Sahib, which was initially part of this entire context, has now become an isolated island in itself. So it has become an island where you can go independently and you just get out and you have an experience of the Harmandir Sahib. But what about the experiential journey as far as the entire context of the historic area is concerned? So that's a question that is to be questioned. This is issues which we have over the time, but this is what Anand Kumaraswamy, he had written in during our just after the independence of India, where he said that India affords the most tragic spectacle of the world, since we see there a living and a magnificent organization akin to but infinitely more complete than that of medieval Europe, still in the process of its destruction. One questions sometimes whether it is wiser to accelerate the process of destruction than attempt to preserve the broken fragments of the great tradition. So what's a better option, whether you destroy the entire thing and rebuild, or are we looking at preserving it? So I'll come down to the approaches which have been taken so far by UNESCO, ICOM. They all propagate different kind of approaches. These are the overarching bodies which so ICOM is basically an international committee for museum, and ICOM basically looks at museum and sites, and it actually talks about capacity building. But then we can't actually look at something like a common stamp on it, especially as far as, and that has now become more in question as far as in the last 2 decades, that the South Asia is questioning whatever stamp we earlier used to use from the Western world. So I'll just talk very briefly about this, because initially, the very initial part was we started with material-based approach, which was, we are talking about the 19th century, because that was needed that time, because of war, because of a lot of political instability and other things. A lot of buildings were getting destroyed, and so this material-based approach was very important, where they were looking at just the building which had to be, preserved. And not even restored, it was just preserved, try to keep it as it is. No community involvement actually was taken at that time. Then they came down to value-based approach, which was propagated over the time. So you have a lot of these people, different kind of people. It can be local community, it can be professionals, it can be, if there are tourists, the tourism department there, then you have the government people, you have the PWD department. So all these people can come together, and the values of each of them actually is taken into consideration for protecting and using these things. The conservation professional office, they have a overarching this thing to put all these things together. But here the problem is also about that whether whose value, because you can't actually agree to everybody's values. At the same time, sometimes it also becomes that when you talk about the local community, they might be talking about, or even if you talk about other people, they might be talking about some values which might not be good for the actual site. So how do we look at it? So this is also some things where there are contested spaces which actually happen. Historic urban landscape was something which was propagated by UNESCO 2011, where he talked about that there is nothing like just a tangible heritage and the intangible heritage, but there are these urban landscapes that are historic areas where you have these buildings, you have the intangible part of it, and this whole thing comes together. So it's all about the livability of the urban areas and foster economic development and social cohesion in changing global environment. So it's the urban heritage, including its tangible and intangible components. So all these things have to be looked at together. So they had these 6 different critical sites. You can find them on the net everywhere. The latest that we are actually looking at is the living heritage concept. So there is this YouTube, but I don't know whether I have time to work on it. It's a small YouTube, I think. You can have a look with it. Can you see it? No.
Yes, madam, we can see it.
Is it a 1 minute?
Intangible cultural heritage takes infinite forms. It is a source of human creativity and cultural diversity. Living heritage brings human beings and communities closer together. The 2003 convention aims at safeguarding this heritage and ensuring its continuous transmission. In 10 years, UNESCO listed almost 500 intangible cultural heritage elements. But how do we grasp the diversity of these elements? How are the cultural practices of communities across more than 100 countries connected? UNESCO mapped them all against 1,000 concepts and invites you to dive into intangible cultural heritage. How does living heritage relate to nature? And what about you? What about your heritage? Keep it lively and pass it on.
Yeah, so that's what we look at when we talk about living heritage. So this is the latest that has been, discussed as far as heritage management is concerned.